Hello and welcome to Colonial Cooking, where we use modern methods to make some delicious food from the time of James Monroe. My name is Hannah and I am an Albert J. Boley Scholar at the James Monroe Museum. As I make this video, fall is in full swing here in New England where I am riding out quarantine, which means it's apple season. This inspired me to go searching for the perfect apple recipe to celebrate with for today's video, and what better than a 1796 recipe from this cookbook, American Cookery by Amelia Simmons. American Cookery was not the first cookbook to be published in America. That honor belongs to The Complete Housewife by Eliza Smith, an English cookbook published in Williamsburg, then in the colony of Virginia, in 1742. American Cookery was, however, the first cookbook published in America that was authored by an American specifically for American cooks. Its first edition was published in Hartford, Connecticut in 1796, with the second edition published that same year in Albany, New York. Very little is known of the author, Amelia Simmons, although she is referred to as an American orphan on the title page of the cookbook and hints at the difficult life she had to endure as an orphan in its prefaces. Despite Simmons' personal struggles, her cookbook combined traditional British foods with American ingredients, terms, and recipes, helping to solidify the new American identity forming in the wake of the Revolutionary War. While Monroe himself wouldn't have done any cooking, he would have seen this new identity forming firsthand. In the few decades prior to the publishing of the cookbook, Monroe fought in the Revolutionary War, even sustaining a wound at the Battle of Trenton, and later rising through the ranks until he became a major in the Continental Army. Following his service in the war, Monroe was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates, the Continental Congress, and the U.S. Senate, among other offices, giving him a front row seat to the building of the new nation. In 1796, the year the cookbook was published, Monroe, who had been serving as an American minister to France since 1794, was recalled. He didn't return to the U.S. until 1797, when he quickly got right back into politics, beginning his first term as governor of Virginia in 1799. Now that you have a bit of a picture of how this cookbook fits into Monroe's lifetime, let's talk food. Without further ado, we're going to be making an apple tart today, which is a modern adaptation of Amelia Simmons' recipe for apple tarts. As we go through each step, I will have the portion of the original recipe that relates to the step we're doing along the bottom of the screen so that you can compare the original to my modern translation. I will offer the disclaimer, I am not a trained pastry chef by any means, but you don't need to be a professional to have fun baking. So let's get to it. We'll be working with a handful of ingredients today, some of which are used in the original recipe and some of which are modern substitutions. For the filling, we'll need 1 pound of sliced apples, which is about 5 to 6 medium apples. I've left the type of apple up to you as the chef, but generally tart, crisp apples are best for baking. But I'll let you in on a little family secret passed down from my very own Nana. Use a variety of apples with those characteristics. Use some that are crisp and a little bit sweet, and some that are crisp but more on the tart side. The combination of flavors will bring your tart from pretty good to really good. Now you'll also need 3/4 of a teaspoon of cinnamon, a 1/4 cup of granulated sugar, a 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla extract, and a tablespoon of sherry cooking wine. For the crust, you'll need 1½ cups of all-purpose flour, a cup of cold unsalted butter cut into cubes, so you can go ahead and leave the butter in the fridge until we're ready to make the crust, and an egg white. To assemble the tart, you'll need another egg white, an orange, and enough all-purpose flour to flour your work surface and dough. I have pre-measured all of our ingredients here to make the process flow more easily, but please feel free to pause the video at any time so that you can work at your own pace. No one's winning any awards for fastest tart bake. It's all about making the tastiest tart possible. Lastly, for tools, you'll need a large mixing bowl, a medium mixing bowl, a cutting board and a sharp knife, a peeler, a flour sifter, something to mix the apples with, a rolling pin, some parchment paper, and a baking sheet. Now, going back to the roots of this recipe, we will not use any electric mixers or food processors today. We are off the grid, my friends. Well, unless you count the oven, but we can get away with that. So without further ado, let's get to it. Alright, this first step relates to the first step in Amelia's recipe, where she writes stew and strain the apples. Now I should also note at this point, before we get too far in, if you would like to follow along with the written recipe in addition to this video, the written recipe will be linked in the description below. So I've gotten a little bit more specific with the first step that Amelia has. And I've also gone ahead and chopped most of the apples already, so you don't have to sit here and watch me slice apples for an hour. But I have saved one to demonstrate the technique I use to slice them. I've got my peeler here, so we'll start with peeling the apple. Now if you want to challenge yourself, you can try to see how long of a peel you can get without stopping. And you'll probably do a much better job than me because I am admittedly not a very good peeler. So once we've peeled our apple, we're going to want to core it. So you're just going to slice around the core like so. And you do want to try to avoid getting any of those little hard pieces of the core in your apples. But if you do, worry not, like I'm doing right now. I'll show you what to do if it happens since I just did it. What you'll do is you can just take your knife and go ahead and slice that hard bit right out. You don't want to get any of that hard bit in your finished tart. So just slice that right on out. All right. So now that we've cored the apple, we're going to want to slice it into nice thin slices. Now you want your slices to be about 1/8 of an inch thick, which is about the thickness of 2 quarters stacked. Slice just like that. All right, so there are nice thin slices. And once you've done that with all of your apples, you can go ahead and put them into a large mixing bowl just like this one. Now I've put my cutting board aside, and we're going to combine the apples with all of the good stuff that'll give our tart that amazing fall flavor. For this step, Amelia writes, add cinnamon, rose water, wine, and sugar to your taste. You'll notice that our list of ingredients is a little bit different. While you can feel free to use rose water, I've decided to use vanilla instead as it is a more common flavor these days. It is a perfectly acceptable substitute as, like rose water, vanilla has a concentrated flavor. Also, wine isn't the most specific direction, so using some deduction, I've chosen sherry cooking wine as the stand-in for wine in this recipe. Other baked good recipes from Amelia called for a sack, which was a Portuguese white wine. Sherry is a sort of modern equivalent of this wine, so I've selected it to use in our recipe. So let's add the good stuff. I like to add the cinnamon and the sugar to the apples. And then give them a good mix till all of the dry ingredients are distributed. Throwing things outside the bowl a little bit. All right. And so after I've added the cinnamon and the sugar and mixed it up nice, I will also add the vanilla and the sherry. And now, same as with the cinnamon and sugar, you're going to want to give it a nice mix so that it's evenly distributed. So now that that's all mixed up, I do always like to give it a little taste just to make sure it's good. I'd say that tastes pretty good. So now what I like to do while we're preparing the crust is to keep these apples in the refrigerator so they stay nice and crisp. So I'm just going to cover them up with some plastic wrap and then pop them right in the fridge. So now we move on to the crust. In Amelia's recipe, she directs the cook to lay the apples in paste number 3, the recipe for which is also found in American Cookery under the section Puff Paste for Tarts. In the recipe for paste number 3, all Amelia writes in terms of flour is to any quantity of flour, and then goes on to give the next direction. Not very specific, is it? So it took a little bit of experimentation, but here's the modern translation. To start, get your medium mixing bowl and your flour sifter. We're going to sift the 1.5 cups of flour into the bowl here, like so. Now, one might ask, why go through the extra step of dumping the flour right into the sifter instead of right into the bowl? Well, sifting the flour makes it lighter, which in turn makes it easier to mix with our other ingredients. This is important as we move to our next step, which is rubbing the butter into the flour. For this step, Amelia directs to any quantity of flour, rub in 3/4 of its weight in butter. So using roughly the same ratio as Amelia and the same technique she used, we're going to combine our flour and butter. If your butter has been hanging out in the fridge prior to this and is nice and cold, you can go ahead and take it out. If your butter has been out at room temperature, I recommend pausing the video and putting your butter into the fridge for a while to let it chill. Cooler temperature is essential to the success of this crust. Go ahead and cube the butter. Take it out of the wrapping here. So go ahead and cube the butter like so. Having the butter in the cubes like this will make it easier to rub in. So we have got those. Let's do our other one. 2 sticks of butter in this crust. It is a very nice buttery and flaky crust. Alright, so there are our cubes of butter. Adding about a handful of butter at a time, take only your fingertips and begin to combine the flour and the butter by rubbing them together. It's kind of like this sort of motion, like that. So we're taking it, rubbing the butter and the flour together between our fingertips. And so it's important to use just your fingertips because your palms are warmer than the tips of your fingers. So if you're rubbing the butter in with your palms, the butter is going to heat up faster and we don't actually want that. Warmer butter would fully incorporate into the dough, and we don't want that, like I said. What we do want, and what cold butter will help us achieve, is little pockets of buttery flavor that will really help with the flakiness and overall taste of this crust. Now this technique is exactly how it sounds. We are rubbing the fat into the flour so that the proteins in the flour are coated in the fat. The crumb which results from this method is finer and more tender, which in turn creates a flaky, buttery crust for our tart. Some people do use a food processor to combine the butter with the flour, known as cutting in, so if that is the method you prefer, you can use that method instead. Today in Colonial Cooking, however, we're doing it the old school, low-tech way. Well, except for the oven, but it is admittedly much easier to bake in an oven that can keep the temperature steady for us. Anyhow, you'll want to keep adding butter about a handful at a time, rubbing it in until the mixture resembles fine breadcrumbs with no large chunks of butter remaining. Some small chunks are okay because, again, we don't want the butter to fully incorporate into the dough. Now this process can be a bit time consuming, so I'm going to go ahead and speed the video up. Again, please feel free to pause the video and take your time. If you're having some trouble getting the chunks of butter to break up, you can use some knives and just kind of slice at the chunks, kind of like doing the cutting in method with the food processor, except again, we're doing it the low-tech way, so doing it with knives. And that can kind of help you break up some of those bigger chunks of butter if you're having a little bit of trouble with that. Okay, so now that the butter is mostly rubbed into the flour, again, no huge chunks, but a few smaller ones are okay. In my experience, as I'm adding the last of the butter, the dough does begin to form more of a ball, which is okay, as long as you break up the really big chunks of butter. Now, once all the butter is added, Amelia writes, whites of egg to a peck, rub in 1/3 or half, and roll in the rest. We're going to incorporate an egg white as well, but do it a little bit differently. We're going to take an egg white and add it to our bowl. The technique that I use to get the egg white is to take the two halves of the shell and basically pour the egg back and forth until the white has gotten in the bowl. Oops, I got a little bit of yolk in there. It's okay. But the most of the yolk is in the shell. Like that. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and throw away the yolk. All right, and so once the egg white is in, we are going to combine the egg white with the dough by kneading the egg in until it is combined and the dough forms a ball. Alright, so we've got our dough ball. Now I added a little bit more flour to my dough because it really didn't want to come together, so I added a little bit more flour. And now I have my baking sheet with my parchment paper already set up. I tried to roll the dough out on the counter and it was very sticky and didn't work too well, so I'm going to try rolling it out directly on the parchment paper, which I have also floured to help make sure the dough doesn't stick too bad. So now we'll take the dough and put it onto the parchment paper, and I am going to put a little more flour on the dough to help make it easier to roll out and not stick to our rolling pin, which I have also floured. And now I'm going to roll it out Ideally, I do this on the counter instead of on the parchment paper, but we're improvising today. So I'm rolling it out, and you want to roll it to that 1/8 inch thickness that we did with the apple slices like before. That 2/4 stacked is what we're going for. And I try to make mine as round as possible. Doesn't always work. It doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to worry about that. Rolling it out. It's okay if it overhangs the edge of the pan a little bit for now, because we are going to be folding it up and over our apples. So it's totally okay if it hangs over a bit. Alright, so I have my crust rolled out, and it is not perfect by any means. It's certainly not round, but that's okay. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to go grab those apples from the fridge that we put in there earlier. And what we're going to do is lay them out in rows over the dough, and we're going to try to overlap them. You don't want them to lay flat against the dough, but instead you'll kind of line them up and overlap them about 1/4 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch, overlapping them so that they lay against each other, kind of like dominoes falling, instead of lying flat against the dough. Now, as you're laying your apples out, you're going to want to make sure you leave a ring of uncovered dough about 2 to 3 inches thick around the edge of the dough, so that you have room to fold the dough up and over the apples. And if you don't want to do the apples in rows, you can certainly do some other design of your choice. This is just the method that I decided to go with. One thing I did forget to do before laying the apples out was to preheat the oven to 350, so I'm going to go do that now. Alright, sorry about that. Now we have the oven preheating, so I'm going to finish laying these out. Alright, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take those edges of the dough that we left uncovered and we're going to fold them up and over the apples. Now, it's okay for dough rips. You can just pinch a little bit off the edge and seal up your rip. I'm just going to move around the dough in a sort of circular motion, folding up and over. Alright, now what I like to do is to take a fork and sort of press the edges just to seal the seams. To press those edges together. As Amelia suggests, I'm also going to take an egg white. We're going to do the same way we did it before. We are going to, I have a bowl here for my pastry brush. I'm going to take the egg white, separate it from the yolk into this bowl here. There we are, beautiful. And then I'm going to take my pastry brush and the egg white in there and then just brush that over the crust, which will help it get that nice golden color that we're going for in the oven. Alright, there we are. We have our apple tart now assembled. And we're just going to do one last thing to kind of help top our tart off. And that is we're going to take an orange and we are going to slice it in half and then squeeze the juice over the tart. Awesome. Our tart is ready to go in the oven now. The only direction Amelia gives as to how to bake the tart is to bake gently. Now we do have to remember that this is before modern ovens that we can just set to 350 and forget about them until the timer goes off. What it basically means is that we must cook the tart at a lower temp for a longer time, hence why we're not going to crank it up to 450 and speed bake. So check to make sure that the oven has gotten up to 350 and go ahead and put the baking sheet right on that middle rack. It'll have to bake for about 55 to 60 minutes or until the apples are tender and the dough is cooked through. Now, while it's baking, I know I've got a lot of dishes to do. Definitely one of my least favorite parts of baking. But I'll be back in a flash with the finished product. Alright, so I'm pulling the tart out of the oven. I did end up pulling it out a little bit early as it cooked pretty fast today. I probably pulled it out around 51, 52 minutes. And so I'm going to let it cool in the pan for a little bit and then we'll be back to talk about the finished product. Alright, here is our finished product, a beautiful apple tart inspired by Amelia Simmons' 1796 recipe. Typically it is served warm or at room temperature, but having eaten it straight out of the refrigerator, I can tell you it tastes just as good served cold. There really isn't a bad way to eat this recipe, it is just that tasty. If you really want to shake things up, you can even serve it with some ice cream or some whipped cream. I want to thank you for coming along with me on this apple tart adventure for today's episode of Colonial Cooking. If you've enjoyed today's video, keep an eye out for future episodes as I hope to be back with a winter recipe in time for the holiday season. Also, if you're enjoying this content, please consider donating to the museum. The link can be found on our Facebook page, James Monroe Museum and Memorial Library, or in the description of this video. Thanks again, and happy fall, y'all!